Hello, Hotep, and welcome to the latest transmission of my Egyptian Magic podcast. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Seth and Knight of Shambhala. Please do continue with the feedback and queries, finding me if you need to on the usual social media channels, Twitter especially, Facebook, quite a presence there. And check out my several books on ancient Egyptian magic and its connections, which are all heavily illustrated and often have images and sources that crop up in these chats. In fact, in this one I might add a few more images to the timeline, because it's quite a complicated thing, especially in the YouTube version, which has a facility I can put a few more slides in there, but I'll put one in there whatever way. Okay, so last time we talked about the Abydos arrangement, in fact, in the course of that, which was this kind of opening rite, which is kind of based on the principle of cardinality of the four square, the four directions, and above, below, and the centre, which is a very Egyptian way of looking at things, and found its way into contemporary magic as kind of opening rite, like the pentagram or whatever. I suppose it connects with what I'm going to talk about a little bit. I felt I kind of needed to talk about, really, which is the thing about the pyramids, which anybody who thinks about Egyptian culture and probably magic, really, sooner or later, or usually sooner, can't help but think about the pyramids, and will ask. I suppose so. The thing of the four square, that when you think, as you say, the four square, you can't help but think about the pyramids. Also, I think in terms of the Abydos arrangement, usually when in magic, if I'm doing something operational, I do the opening thing, that I shared with you, before me in the east Nephthys and behind me in the west Isis, on my right hand in the south Set and left hand Horus. I usually follow that up with something again from the Egyptian tradition, which is the vibration of vowels to the different directions and whatever, and there's an association within the Egyptian tradition of certain vibrations of vowels. When I say vibration, I mean like a kind of mantra, like like ah, basically, but sort of sung ah. So you vibrate these as ah and eh, and so. But the thing I wanted to point out, I'm not going to do an entire manifestation of the ritual; it'll take too long. Is that there are vowels associated with the particular gods of the quarters and above and below, and there's this kind of way of saying them. And also there's, they kind of fall into two sets, really. One related to the god Horus, who goes through this. Not only does he kind of do these sounds, make these sounds, these vowels, the seven sacred vowels as they're known as. He also does certain gestures that are associated with the god Horus. I say you have to see this, and there's some diagrams in the book to explain this, but it's the sign of Horus fighting and moving his arms around as if he's kind of preparing for him and throwing some sort of weapon, probably a spear or a harpoon, which is the weapon he's most associated with. And a harpoon kind of brings to mind something you might throw at an animal in water, which is his nemesis or his brother or his counterpart, which is the god Set, in the form of a hippopotamus, which was kind of hunted, I suppose, by the ancient Egyptians as a kind of ordeal as well. I don't think they hunted it for food. And so the other side of this ritual is connected with Set and the kind of gestures he makes of kind of rising up, if you like, from a kind of downward posture to this posture that was known in the Western esoteric tradition as the kind of Typhon posture, Set Typhon, rising up and making this kind of trident gesture. Perhaps lifting the body of Horus up is another way of doing it. Anyway, this kind of sort of connects us with the pyramids, which was, I know I'm going kind of through a long journey into the different mysteries of Egypt, as partly as I discovered them. I wanted to mention Set because in terms of the calendar as well, as I speak, it's a new moon, and this month, which is by one reckoning is one of the first in the Egyptian New Year, is called Tek, right? Was one name for it, which means a cup, and there's an association, a link between the cup and the deity Set as well. So if you kind of connect it, if you're more favourable towards God Set, then it's another indication. I think because the cup was used for drinking, obviously, but drinking alcohol and perhaps mixed alcohol with strange drugs and stuff, maybe, but certainly strong alcohol, and this intoxication element, especially in the first month, but it recurs in other months as well, it's quite a thing, was associated with Set quite a lot as a god of one of the things he kind of intoxication, and especially alcohol is something very associated with the mythology and the life of the Egyptian god Set Typhon. So his month in the Western mystery tradition, or in certainly the revived Egyptian tradition I follow, is just starting today, in fact. So that's rather nice. Anyway, as I said, anybody who's exploring this kind of territory of Egyptian culture and magic will pretty soon be asked for an opinion about the pyramids and the Sphinx. You wouldn't think you had to have an opinion, but it's a kind of big issue, really. It's such a kind of central thing within our discovery of Egypt, is this question of the Sphinx. In fact, the Sphinx is used, the mystery and the enigma of the Sphinx is almost used as an emblem of the magical life itself, of understanding the riddle of the Sphinx. And so there is a riddle connected with the Sphinx now. If there wasn't before, they've certainly found one. In fact, I can recall when I went to a conference, I don't know, a few years ago now, in Glastonbury of all places, and I recall I had a conversation, I was introduced to an interesting person, and our first conversation, we went outside for a smoke and a chat, and he's a quite respected, or has certainly got a following author, perhaps a bit controversial. And it was virtually the first question he asked me of our conversation when we got outside was, how old do I think the pyramids of Giza are in Egypt? I was slightly taken aback by that. Although, as I say, I've kind of been around a while and this stuff comes up in conferences and stuff, but in a way I kind of didn't expect it from someone who I knew mainly through the practice of magic. Anyway, he said, well, do you follow the kind of orthodox view of them as being the product of the Egyptian Old Kingdom? Or do you, he said, and I must say his eyes were sparkling a bit as they tend to, do you think they might be much older? Older as in the sense of really old. I should say the orthodox view is that the Great Pyramid is something like, maybe there's disappointment, maybe 2200 BC, which doesn't sound quite as I always thought it would be a bit older than that, but even me. But obviously we're talking about a theory that would say that they're 10,000 BCE, which is really, if you consider from an Orthodox point of view that the first stirrings of the Egyptian culture, which is usually kind of connected with what they call the process of unification of Egypt into one united kingdom, rather than lots of different kind of chieftain areas and different city-states and whatever, to unite them all together, which was obviously traumatic in some ways, or it certainly involved a certain amount of conflict and warfare according to the records as people interpret them. This is usually dated to about 4,000 BCE, 4,000 years before the time of the beginning of the Common Era, or before the coming of Christ, if you like, if you want to see it that way. So that's 4,000 years. This would be the first, even before language really got going that much. There were early bits of language, but there weren't very extensive texts, and things were quite sort of primeval in some ways. But to go back another to 10,000 years before the Common Era, well, you're talking about prehistory. But believe it or not, there are people around, quite a lot of them, quite a lot of books. In fact, you'd say in a way this is, in terms of the popular literature about Egypt, they kind of dominate really the point of view that there's this ancient civilization that predates the Egyptian one, and it's not Egyptian in any sense. I mean, some people obviously go even further. I don't know how common this is, and it sounds ridiculous when I put it. It sounds ridiculous. Would say that this kind of an alien civilization, in a sense of extraterrestrial, almost like aliens, come to Egypt or what was to become Egypt, and they do all sorts of things. And one of the things that they do is that they build the pyramids of Egypt, to put it kind of bluntly, which, I mean, there are various permutations on this theory, it has to be said. Some would say it all hinges around the Sphinx, again, the Sphinx Enigma. It could be possible that people would say, well, the Sphinx looks so different to all the rest of it that perhaps it was already there, built by somebody else. It's a prehistoric, maybe a stone that's been shaped into some way, but its origins are much older than anything, and the Egyptians maybe built the entire complex around it. That's one permutation of the theory. Or that, you see, the problem with that is that the Sphinx is sort of embedded in the entire complex, and it can be difficult to separate the Sphinx from the entire Great Pyramid and the three pyramids that are there, the Great Pyramid and whatever, the Pyramid of Khufu and Khafre, and then the smaller Queen's Pyramids and all the rest. The whole ritual complex is quite a big place. The Sphinx is kind of built into it, and that's why, to see that argument, there could be a workaround for this, it has to be said, and I'm sure people do have a workaround, and whatever I might say, the people who've written the books obviously studied this thing quite a lot, and I'm sure they've encountered some of what I'm saying before. So, on the picture, the one photograph that I am going to reproduce in such a way that you can see it if you're on your smartphone or whatever, is this aerial view of the Sphinx, which shows all the kind of different features, hopefully you should be able to see, that generate this very strange argument, I think. And you can see that the Sphinx is actually built into into like a quarry, essentially, into a pit. And you'll be able to see the pit. Now, you think, look, if even from an Egyptian point of view, you kind of think, look, if you're going to build a kind of a pit, well, they don't build a pit. Essentially, they excavate that area of the Giza plateau, and they take out the stone. They quarry the stone and they use it to build the pyramids. But they leave a section of it. This is a theory. Or the first of the colossal statues, probably in history, is the biggest statue that's from that period of time, whatever period of time you take it. If you take it to 3rd millennium BC or whatever, there's nothing. Nobody's ever built anything as big as that as a statue. I should say before I kind of analyse the diagram for you that, you know, obviously I'm into mystery and this sort of speculation about the pyramids and ancient aliens. I mean, I wouldn't be the only person that this was incredibly exciting when I first read about this stuff in the newspaper. This was the thing that really turns you on in a way. Is it kind of, this is what seems like real magic. And even though it must be obvious, maybe because I'm talking about this, I don't completely follow this point of view anymore. Even though I loved it at first, reading Eric von Daniken and then all these other books. I think they're really exciting books, and sometimes there's stuff in there that I still think is valuable. But obviously, this seems like a very magical, special view. But after a while, as I studied this stuff, I came to think, well, what do you do with this material? You know, I don't want to. I think in a way, there's enchantment in the Orthodox view as well. If you know where to look, there's plenty of magic and mystery and enigmas in the structure of even something like the Giza pyramids, which we're probably going to have to explore quite a lot. So what I'm saying is not disenchanting, I don't think. I think in a way I'm going to put the enchantment back into the equation. Because this theory of making it not Egyptian, of pushing it back into some nameless era, which we know nothing about, and even saying that it's kind of built by aliens or something, in the end there's not a lot you can really do with that. I don't think. It just sort of overwhelms you. Well, there shouldn't be any disappointment in what I'm going to say. In a way, I think the truth is actually more magical and more interesting than this kind of fantastic story about it being a prehistoric work or even the work of aliens. I don't know if I'm going to go into that today, whether there'll be time completely, but over the last year I've been working on a kind of another mystery, which is reading about. Someone asked me to think about this thing in the Bible of these entities called the Nephilim, which again I didn't think that was going to be anywhere to go with that. But as I looked into it and discovered that it was really good, they said, "Oh, what's that? Is there anything in Egypt?" And I discovered the whole thing really fits within an Egyptian context when you look into it. And there's loads of sources that people are using that are actually Egyptian. My theory, if you like, or they also fit, is part of that, right? It will be stempelized on that, and that will. So the magic of the Nephilim really is what might end up with, rather than the magic of ancient aliens. But you know, people say, well, maybe the Nephilim are ancient aliens, but that's okay. So I'm thinking about the work, I should mention, of John Anthony West. I should get the name right because he's just died, I think, and Robert Schock. Published a number of famous books on this and did actually do some kind of exploration on the site and surveying of the site. Anyway, what they looked at, or what they noticed, was what they called the evidence of flood damage on the limestone sedimentary layers of this kind of quarry, this pit in which the Sphinx is cut, and other flood damage that is found all the way around the Sphinx enclosure, really. So you can see that. You should be able to see some of that, these kind of rivulets, really, in the stone, that's even on the aerial photograph, around the edge of the pit into which the Sphinx is cut. The other thing is that you might see from there is that the quarry itself, the enclosure in which they cut into the bedrock, presumably to build the Egyptians to build the Sphinx, is not a nice neat oblong, as you would expect. I would think it's kind of quite an irregular shape, really, and that's because one of the causeways that goes up to the pyramid of Khafre from his temple, which would have been at the water's edge, to the kind of another temple that would have existed outside the pyramid, it runs right beside the Sphinx, as you would expect, really. So it's almost as if it really had been, if the Sphinx enclosure had been carved 10,000 years ago, then whoever did that would have had to kind of think, well, in 10,000 years' time, when they come to build the pyramids, they're going to have to put a causeway there, so we're going to better leave a little gap for it, which is ludicrous, really, and you'd have to say. So it implies that the Sphinx and the pyramids are kind of built as one thing. They're kind of embedded one within the other. So if one bit's going to be 10,000 BCE or thereabouts, whatever date you put on it, then the whole lot has to be that, and that means the pyramids themselves. They've probably got a workaround for that, but it's a bit of a problem, I think, to do that. I kind of put this to someone, and they said, well, there's a kind of set of arguments that people always put, right? I kind of, on Twitter, someone said, well, the evidence is there for rainfall, presumably. So being the sort of person I kind of ask, well, all right, say you've got evidence of rainfall and water damage. What makes you think that couldn't have been done after the pyramids were built in the Orthodox timeline? Maybe it was wetter. How do you know it wasn't wetter then? Well, how do you know what the climate was like then? I know it seems fairly arid and all the rest, and it's assumed that there wasn't much rainfall because Egypt is not famous for its rainfall, it's famous for its Nile inundation. That's the major source of the water. But how do you know, right? You do see water damage all over the place. And it does rain. It rains now. There's all sorts of... so the evidence of the ancient climate is the water damage. Maybe records are wrong if they say it doesn't rain. Anyway, it's... I mean, I suppose the other thing, if you've ever been on if you go into the wonderful Cairo museum, the old museum, I'm sure the new one, I haven't had a chance to visit yet, is wonderful as well, then there'll always be kind of crowds of people and on some sort of tour or whatever, and the tour guys always have the popular theories to kind of share with them, and sure enough they'll take you into a room and they'll show you the only statue of the pharaoh Khufu of one of the early dynasties who built the Great Pyramid, in fact. And they say, well, you've got the Great Pyramid, the largest of all the pyramids there, next door. And yet the only thing they've ever found is this tiny, it is quite small, a few centimetres high statue of Khufu. So it's like you can't prove any connection between the pharaoh Khufu and this pyramid. Apart from that, well, this apparently is not enough. And recently when I was talking about this, someone said, well, have you got any evidence for that connects them together? Of course, all of this now, right, it has to be said, is kind of blown out of the water by a new book, but also a lecture, a new piece of archaeological research that kind of settles it in a way, I think. I'm sure people will be working quite hard to work around it or ignore this or whatever. I don't know what they're going to do about it. But whereas previously you could say, well, look, there's only this tiny little statue of Khufu and there's no evidence, there is, but you could say, oh, there's no evidence of any connection between these 4th dynasty, 5th dynasty pharaohs and these buildings. Anyway, I was lucky enough to go to a lecture before the book was published. The book is called The Red Sea Scrolls, not the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the Red Sea Scrolls. And it caught my eye because I was always been interested in stuff in the desert, rock art, if you like, stuff in the desert itself. And obviously, I'm not the only one. Lots of people are actually doing research on this. Primarily, the guy leading this French expedition, Pierre Tallet, they discovered a harbour, an ancient harbour on the side of the Red Sea, opposite the Sinai Peninsula. So there was obviously a shuttle you have to look at a map to see why this happens. So you go across from the area of Giza, I suppose, or the pyramids, across the desert till you get to Suez, essentially what is Suez, and the Suez, Gulf of Suez, and the beginning of the Red Sea. Then you've got this gulf there, so then there's a harbour there, an ancient harbour. It took them a long time. It was first stumbled upon 100 years ago, maybe by Wilkinson apparently, and then other times, but events over, nobody was able to excavate this, or they originally didn't know what it was. It's quite a major construction. The scale of it is enormous, and what it is it's the harbour for all of or for a big section of the workers, mariners basically, who worked on the pyramid of Khufu. And they're named after Khufu, and, they essentially, what they would have done is, in the season, they would go across the desert to the Gulf of Suez. They would cross in boats over into the Sinai, which you probably know is a huge source of minerals and metals and all sorts of things that the Egyptians use and needed, but primarily copper. They use a heck of a lot of copper, which was the main tool that they use, is to make these very small chisels about the size of your finger, really, which they needed a lot of, because it's an amazing thought that all of the stone on the pyramids, if you go and see it, was dressed by masons using chisels that are just the width of your finger. So they had to have hundreds of these things that had to be sharpened every few minutes. So they have a great pile of them and sharpen them at the beginning of the day. So they had a huge desire for this. So this harbour is there. There were, in a sense, the architecture of it, when you look at it, is very, very similar to the architecture of the pyramids, these great colossal stones and these excavated chambers, which they used to store their boats. So at the season, they obviously carried these boats. This is rather another remarkable thing about the Giza thing, is that these boats exist and these chambers exist, which you can go and visit on Giza itself, in which they put these boats as part of the funeral rites. But these boats are like a kind of giant jigsaw puzzle. The entire ship, the entire boat, can be taken down into small parts, each numbered, and can be reassembled again using string and other substances and made into a boat. And this is obviously what they had to do. They had to take it into bits, carry it across the desert to the Red Sea, reassemble it, then go across the Gulf of Suez to the Sinai, to these copper mines and turquoise mines, spend a season mining this stuff and smelting it down on a huge industrial scale, thousands and thousands of furnaces in the desert, bring all this product back, store the boats and all the maritime equipment in these excavated chambers, which were like tombs, and go back across the desert with all their products and come back again the next year. And rather remarkably, in these chambers, they have found maritime equipment, they have found boats that have been burnt, remains of boats, coils of rope, and best of all, is a manuscript, is a papyrus manuscript, lots of them, which are essentially the logbooks of the people who built Khufu's pyramid. Evidence, right? That's the killer fact, right? About when the pyramids were built, who they were built for, whose workers did it, and the effect it had on Egyptian society. In effect, almost the entire nation of Egypt was involved in the construction of the pyramids in terms of working on it, supplying the materials, the food, constructs the nation itself, which is rather a remarkable story. So the idea of the pyramids being 10,000 BC or something, I think in a way it's dead in the water. I mean, in a way, the more you think about it, the more ridiculous it is as an idea. That's pretty definitive, really. But still, so, okay, one way or another, you've still got this issue of the pyramids in the Orthodox time frame, wherever it is, about the 3rd millennia BC, still a heck of a long time ago. Still these remarkable constructions. Still all this stuff, as I say, this evidence of water damage, the fact that other things, that they say that the pyramids themselves, when they were unsealed, were full of salt, accretions of the sort that you might get of water damage. Was it overtaken by some unrecorded, otherwise, tsunami or flood not too long after they were actually built? Old Kingdom, if you like, not too long after they start, the size of the pyramids goes down in size. That's a sign of something. They still want them. They've still got this development. They start small, they get enormous, and then they retreat to small again. And eventually, the Old Kingdom, it comes to an end. It descends into chaos, and the system that works quite well just disappears. You get a whole period of that they call the First Intermediate Period. I don't want to do too much about numbers and dates and everything like that, but it's a period of chaos when that wonderful culture it falls into disarray. The pyramids are abandoned, all the temples are abandoned, the Sphinx is buried in the sand, and all this kind of stuff for quite a long time. And in fact, people write about how the Egyptians themselves write about how the mighty have fallen, really, how it's come to an end, and there's kind of nothing good came of it. Nobody came back. In the end, it didn't do us any good. The society fell apart. There's actually literature that says that. And the situation that came after the building of the pyramids was so traumatic, was so difficult, that this is the moment when we trace the creation of magic to. Magic must have existed before in the Egyptian culture, but the intermediate period is the time when an awful lot of the magical records first become known, and certainly some of the entities, the demonic entities that people fight against, especially Apophis, when they first kind of emerge, really. The name Apophis is not known, which is the name of this ancient entity of chaos and destruction. It doesn't appear in the record before this. When it seems to be active, it is a time of chaos and destruction, and that's when this entity Apophis comes, and eventually it's when people start creating magic, an observation really, to kind of deal with this stuff. The things are all it's linked, don't you think? I mean, I think there's likely to be a link between this. Things like flood damage and evidence of tsunamis and natural disasters, the abandonment and eventual destruction and decline of the Egyptian culture, the rise of this entity which is the personification of absolute evil, which is about chaos and lack of order. All these things, I would have thought, must be connected in some ways. I mean, the other thing that you have to say that's important from the Egyptian point of view, that we've talked about a few times, is this idea, not only that they also write about, and their mythology is full of allusions and references to this buried world, to this lost world, which is not just, I don't think they just mean the Old Kingdom. That's a lost world in a way. It could be that. But also to the lost world, without contradicting myself, a lost world before the unification of Egypt in the prehistoric. They have this idea, which I've explored quite a lot in other places, and which is connected with this idea of the Nephilim, of a previous existence. They thought that they existed before. They don't have any clear evidence of it, and maybe they didn't. I mean, it could be the sort of thing that all cultures, all ancient cultures, have this idea that we're on our last legs. There was the golden age was sometime in the past, and we live, say from a Hindu point of view, we live in the Kali age, which is the last and worst of everything. Everything's. It could be just that. It could be just maybe human beings always think in that way, that it was better in some lost world in the past. It could be that. Or that it's a deep psychological thing. It's part of some sort of deep memory that we have in some ways, in the way that whenever people go into trances and mystical stuff. In the Corpus Hermetica I was reading the other day, they taught the first line of this ancient magical book is he says that this giant entity appeared to him, which is the god Thoth. So people always envisage, naturally when they go into magical trance, things as this giant entities from a kind of distant realm. So there could be something to do with consciousness. It could be something that really happened, you know. Whether there was a real existence, there was some sort of awareness of a past in the timeline, in the song line, if you like, going back far enough. None of the evidence about the Sphinx really backs that up. Right, there's other evidence that does, right? There's other stuff from a prehistoric time that is much more favourable to that point of view. It just happens this isn't it. It might be that the Egyptians build things in such a way to suggest that sort of mystery, because this is what they believe. They often make things look much older than they really are, even though they're old to us. When they built them, they make them look archaic, because they want that. They want you to think that way, because this is what they believe the truth is. One way or another, we will have to come back and think about this a little bit more, about the riddle of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and some of the deeper mysteries that are kind of encoded there. But certainly in terms of magic, as we practice it now, revived from the Egyptian realm, this idea of something buried beneath us, either in our consciousness, buried in our memories in some way, which we represent in the pyramids and in temple design as buried underneath us, as buried beneath the floor. And sometimes there really were things, often were things buried beneath the floor, mysteries beneath us. This mental image is probably one of the important things that you do, that I discovered anyway, that I think you do have to kind of bring to mind in magic. You do have to think about the ground, as I say, the four square, the above, the below and the centre. You think about the ground, but in a sense you also think about how unstable it is, or how there's something there. I'm just thinking now as I speak, there's a practice in other traditions, in the Nordic tradition, I think we might connect to this, which is called seder or seething, that's sometimes translated as, and one envisages yourself to do that kind of magical work or shamanic work as not actually standing on solid ground, but standing on the body of a dragon that's living underneath you. So the ground is very uncertain and state of mind to be in, rather than feeling so I mean, in a way, when you're in a ritual and you're kind of standing four square and you're not really. It's difficult to see what the mystery is. It's almost like when you're moving and when you're off balance, and you allow yourself to go off balance and to sway and to try and control these things, like standing on the deck of one of those Egyptian ships, which would be another common image for them. It's only when you kind of have that mindset of something beneath you that is not completely steady, that is a little bit tricky in some sort of way, when you bring that to mind and awareness of that, whatever name you give to it, that is quite an important aspect of magic. It was important to me, as I say, when I first learned that technique, to stop being steadied, but to allow people have all sorts of words of the energy of the earth or whatever, but essentially they're allowing the idea that the earth is not this rock solid thing, that it's actually quite a living entity in some ways, with all sorts of chambers and places that go off. And this is something that's been brought back into magic, that people teach, and they learn these techniques. And as you learn the techniques, you realise that this is maybe what the Egyptians wanted to do with their temples. Why did they make their buildings? They made them huge structures that have lasted all this, but they also made them quite unsteady. They're not always built on the most solid of foundations, and sometimes some of the water damage you mentioned might be the fact that they built it not in the best place. They built it deliberately to make contact with an unsteady layer within the earth, and that's something you don't think about. It's counterintuitive, and it's something that we replicate, or we might choose to replicate just another of those things in the magic and meditation that we do. Anyway, there were some initial thoughts on the pyramids and the mystery of the Sphinx. Do look at the diagram, which I tried to explain, and maybe check out this book, The Red Sea Scrolls, How Ancient Papyri Reveal the Secrets of the Pyramids, which has just come out. See it in the library or something. Got beautiful pictures. Tells a fantastic, interesting story about the way the pyramids are built and the people who built them. Thank you for listening. Senapti, and speak to you soon.